So we're standing here. This is our fermentation room. Right in front of me here is a corn mash or a bourbon mash. It is technically bourbon, but we just call it our corn mash. This is 90% corn, 10% of our 2-row barley malt. So standing in front of a bourbon mash, and we're looking into these big open wooden tubs. Fermentation was something, coming from a brewing background, I wanted to put a lot of focus on in what we're doing here at Black Frost. I had done a lot of work in sour beer production, mixed culture sours, and really saw the benefit of using wooden tanks and how it can affect the flavor by creating its own little microbiome, allowing wild yeast and bacteria to kind of ingrain into the wood and contribute to the overall flavor of the product that you're making. And with us having a big focus on terroir, that concept of terroir, fermentation is a huge driver of that, in that allowing wild yeast and bacteria to contribute to the flavor of the fermentation really helps add to the overall flavor of what we're trying to make. These tanks here, they were old wooden wine tanks called foeders. They were built in 1989, French oak. Spent 25 years at a winery in California. Had a 5-year pit stop at a brewery in Chicago before they made their way north here. They were originally twice as tall. We just cut the tops off and rebuilt them here as just open wooden tubs. We don't use any artificial cooling. We design our fermentations to just naturally dissipate the heat that is generated during fermentation. Below us here, this is a fermentation that's at high krausen, or at the peak of activity, and it doesn't even look like there's that much happening. And that's by design. We wanted to have these very long, slow, drawn-out fermentations. We're trying to make more complex alcohols and a softer spirit coming out of the fermentation tank that way. For us, a typical fermentation is 7 days, 6 days of active fermentation, 1 day of rest. We're pitching pretty cool, 68 degrees, letting it free rise up to 90, 92 degrees over that course of 6 days before it cools back down again and gets distilled. Each one of our fermentations is a little bit different. We treat them differently because of the grains that we're using and how the yeast reacts during fermentation. Corn mashes is a nice, steady rise, and a lot of heat is generated during that fermentation. Our rye fermentations tend to be a little bit slower, so we'll pitch those warmer early on, and it's a slower ramp up during fermentation. That one seems to generate a lot of its own microflora, we'll say. So typically at the end of fermentation, we'll get this nice white sheen over the top of our tank. That's called a pellicle. And that's all from the grain itself, the wild yeast and bacteria that come from the grain from the farm here locally. Wheat fermentations, that's a little quicker one, so we're gonna pitch that cooler again. That it has a nice steady fermentation. And then our single malts, or just our straight malt fermentation, that's probably the most aggressive fermentation, so we're pitching that the coolest. And that's a quicker rise through fermentation, and it makes this big, beautiful, fruity aroma during fermentation. The yeast definitely reacts well with the pure malt. Even though we don't have set mash bills, we do incorporate quite a bit of specialty malt. So that's caramel malt, caramel rye, caramel wheat. That adds layers of complexity within those individual blending components that we're making. I think that also adds to that depth of flavor overall. And as you blend them in to create our bourbon, it definitely showcases in these layers of flavors beyond just the straight grain itself. The yeast strain that we're using here is really unique. It's a non-Saccharomyces strain called the Schizosaccharomyces pombe. This is a fission yeast. It's not a budding yeast. It's really unique in that it originated, the particular strain that we're using originated from the rum world in the Caribbean, where it was cultivated in these wild fermentations and banked over 100 years ago. So it produces this really interesting, unique flavor. It's very like fruity, floral type of an aroma that is really hard to describe, but it just has this like really almost radiant quality to it that you can definitely taste in the spirit, and it comes through, and that's all driven by fermentation. The drawback of using this really unique strain is that it's not available commercially, and so we have to propagate it and grow it to pitch in-house. And that means every single day, starting at a single 1 milliliter slant, we're propagating that yeast strain up into a pitchable quality, which for us is 200 gallons going into these 2,000 gallon fermentations. The benefit of that, though, is that one, we can use a yeast strain it's unique only to us. And two, we can really have a strong sense of what's happening during fermentation. That's another benefit of having wood and open top fermenters. You can look at the fermentation every day, see if it's on track, off track, and just visually use those indicators to adjust our pitching rates that way, and also, the data that we're getting by checking it every day. And so for us, we pitch very low. It's an extremely low pitching rate. And we're doing that intentionally, one, to slow down fermentations. We want that long, slow fermentation. We're allowing kind of the bacteria to essentially take a strong foothold before fermentation ramps up. That's going to help create longer chain esters that we can then capture in the distillation process. But then two, because we don't have any artificial cooling, having that slow fermentation allows the heat to dissipate over the course of a week, and not just this crazy fast fermentation that's going to generate too much heat and really stress out the yeast. Allowing that fermentation to gradually heat up over time also gives us dial in that peak point and where we want to have that, where we start to get those big fruity estery aromas. And that's all designed by pitching rates and how we add the yeast, the temperature that we add the yeast during fermentation.